Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, our coverage of the latest out of the Middle East continues. Some recent headlines here. Today, President Biden said G7 nations are discussing sanctions against Iran in response to the latest attack against Israel. Iran fired about 200 ballistic missiles at Israel on Tuesday, a sharp but brief escalation between Middle Eastern adversaries that threatened to trigger a fresh round of attacks as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to retaliate.
And President Biden saying Israel should hold off from attacking Iran's nuclear facilities in retaliation. That was something we got today.
We got a really timely guest with a historical perspective to a situation that has been centuries in the making. Yardena Schwartz is a journalist and author. Her new book is Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Came out just yesterday. She joins us from New York. Yardena, before we go back to 1929, which we're going to get to, you're an expert on the region. You're someone who spent more than a decade reporting from Israel. You've studied the history of the region. Weigh in on the events, not just of the last 2 days, but of the last year.
First, thank you so much for having me. The events we're seeing today, in which there is already this broader war against Israel by Iran and its proxies in the region, really shows us that this is not a conflict about land as it has been treated for decades. This is a holy war, as I argue in my book, and it needs to be looked at as such. And we see that very clearly now, in which this war is not just between Israelis and Palestinians, it is between Iran and its proxies in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. For the last year, this didn't just start, as you said, yesterday or last week. It's been going on, and as I argue in my book, began 1 century ago with a massacre in what was then British Mandate Palestine.
Well, take us back to 1929, because it does feel like we need to understand the history. And I feel like we continue to be kind of on a history lesson. For those of us not either from the region, born in the region, lived in the region, or have some personal impact from it, we're constantly kind of studying to understand the complicated nature. Somebody said very simplistically to me, well, it's kind of like gang wars to some extent, because you have so many different groups. How do you see it, and how does going back to 1929 take us back there in terms of what happened, and how that helps us maybe understand a little bit better of where we are today?
Yeah, so many people begin their conversations around the origins of this war with years like 1967 or 1948, but this conflict began long before that, actually 2 decades before we see the emerging of the driving forces behind this conflict today. And those forces are religion, as I said before, but also disinformation. And it was a campaign of disinformation that led to this horrific massacre of one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities in Hebron, in what was then British Mandate Palestine in 1929. And my book elucidates in gripping detail the parallels between that massacre 1 century ago and the massacre of October 7th.
Why do you think so many modern conversations about the history of the region, at least the modern history, started in 1948 and don't go back to 1929? Why do you think this part of history has been, I don't know if I want to say forgotten. I have to tell you, be honest with you though, I had no idea about it until we got this book.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it comes down to people not really being able to wrap their heads around what is a really complicated and a conflict that has such a long history. And so they try to look at it in the simplest way possible. And it makes sense then to begin that story in 1948. But that's like beginning a story in the middle, or like starting a show at episode 25 rather than episode 1. And episode 1 was this massacre in 1929 that really set the stage for the conflict, because you see the emergence of what has become a very prominent lie that is told around Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is the third holiest site in Islam, and it sits upon the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem, and that the Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism. And that kind of tells you why religion is such a big plays such a big role in this conflict. But the rumor that is still told by Muslim leaders today is that the Jews of what was then Palestine were planning to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque. That was the lie that led to the massacre of 1929. And that lie continues to be told today by groups like Hamas or the Ayatollah of Iran, Hezbollah. And you can just look at the name that Hamas gave to its operation on October 7th. It was called Al-Aqsa Flood, because this lie about what the Jews of Palestine in 1929 or today Israel, this lie that they're trying to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple, is such a powerful force, a galvanizing force in the region. And corrupt leaders like the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule in 1929 have managed to distract criticism of corruption, nepotism, misappropriation of funds. For the last century, they've been able to distract their people from their own failures by holding on to this lie that is so powerful.
So then I guess I'm trying to figure out where we go from here. Because, when you say we're seeing parallels of 1929 and what happened roughly 1 year ago with the Hamas attack on Israel, is it happening again because of this, the lies, why, how do we break it then? Like, if we know they're lies, how do we break it?
That's such a great question. I'm so glad you're asking that, because it's actually much bigger than that, because that's just one lie that has been told. But also after the massacre of 1929 and after the massacre of October 7th, we see this widespread denial of the atrocities that were committed against innocent men, women, children, babies. The parallels between the atrocities committed 1 century ago and the atrocities committed on October 7th were so hauntingly similar. And so were the denials that immediately followed that massacre. And at the same time as denial, there was also victim blaming. Arab leaders in 1929 said there were no atrocities, but a day later said, oh, the atrocities were committed by Jews in Hebron. And we saw the same thing after October 7th, people denying that those atrocities took place, that women were raped, and yet also blaming Israel for the massacre or blaming the victims for what happened to them. And I think that really bringing peace this region has so much to do with ending that disinformation, ending this cycle of disinformation that leads to more massacres. I mean, you asked about 1948 earlier. That's another example of denial. I mean, so many people who speak about 1948 speak about the expulsion and what happened to Palestinians in 1948, but they don't speak about the war that was waged against the unborn Jewish state that led to their expulsion.
I want to get right back to our guest, Yardena Schwartz, a journalist and author. Her new book is Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. The book came out yesterday. She joins us from New York. Yardena, I know the book focuses on 1929, but I want to go back even earlier than that and sort of understand how the seeds for this were planted. Maybe even during the British occupation of the area earlier in the century.
Yeah, so we're talking about British Mandate Palestine. This was a mandate given to the British Empire to rule over what it had just conquered from the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled that territory for more than 400 years. And before the Ottoman Empire conquered the region, it was a province of a rotating cast of foreign powers going back to the Romans, the Greeks, the Crusaders. It was actually the Romans who gave Palestine its name. It had been known as the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judea. And when the Jews of Judea carried out a rebellion against the Romans, they punished them by renaming the land after the Israelites' ancient enemies, the Philistines.
Well, and I guess that's what I'm wondering is, you go back to, as we said, the early 1900s and the role of colonialism, the UK specifically, in establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was against the wishes of the indigenous Arab population. You do also wonder how that kind of set the stage, in addition to what you were talking about, which led to the Hebron massacre, that there was more going on that made for a very volatile environment between these two populations.
Absolutely. Yeah, the conflict didn't just begin out of nowhere in 1929. Of course, the tensions between Palestine's Jewish minority and its Arab majority had been simmering for years and had already claimed dozens of lives by 1929. But the massacre in Hebron and the riots that engulfed Palestine that week in August of 1929 really became the first mass casualty event of this conflict and kind of set the formula for every eruption of violence that we have seen since.
You lived in Israel for more than a decade, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and as we've been speaking with our reporters on the ground there, they've shared with us this feeling that people in Israel right now do feel like that the conflict they are fighting is one that is indeed existential. And I'm wondering if you think, given what's going on there today, the actual existence of Israel in the future is threatened.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that understanding that really helps to explain the actions Israel has taken since October 7th. I mean, there's talk of disproportionality, and we heard this from Biden today. But I think if you are in Israel and you see your country being attacked from 7 fronts, and you see a world that doesn't really understand that the only reason we're not seeing mass casualties yesterday and today as a result of Iran's ballistic missile attack is a result of Israel's defense systems. I mean, you don't just have the Iron Dome intercepting some of those rockets, but you also, or many of those rockets, I should say, but you also have the government investing in bomb shelters for Israelis, something that I wish, other countries would do. Imagine if Gazans had bomb shelters or Lebanese civilians had bomb shelters, it could protect them from the terror groups that are embedding themselves within civilian populations. And, Israel really is fighting a war not just against, and the war isn't really against the Palestinians, it's against Hamas, but it's also against Hezbollah. And, like I said earlier, we really should be looking at the names of these organizations because they tell us everything. I mean, Hezbollah's name means the party of God. Hamas's name is the Islamic Resistance Movement in English. So much of what these organizations say themselves, we're not hearing in the West. And what they're saying is they desire to destroy the state of Israel. And Israelis hear that. But I think a lot of us here don't understand that.
So in your thinking about the region and the way forward, we fingers crossed that we get to a better place at some point, although it's hard to see right now. Does a two-state solution in some ways help the situation specifically in Israel and with the Palestinians?
So I do believe that a two-state solution is the only solution to this conflict. And just going back to the history here, I began writing this book nearly 6 years ago. I didn't just pick up and start writing this after October 7th. I was writing about this massacre well before October 7th. And the reason I did was because there was this family in Memphis, Tennessee that I was introduced to that had found this box of letters in their attic containing hundreds of pages of letters from their late uncle who was murdered in the massacre in 1929. And his letters painted this beautiful portrait of peaceful coexistence in Hebron that preceded the massacre. And what really captured me in reading these letters was that I had never known, and many people didn't know or don't know, that Hebron was once a beacon of coexistence in Palestine. And today If you're familiar with Hebron, it is the antithesis of peaceful coexistence. And I think understanding how that happened really can tell us how we can find a way out and work towards peace. Because really, if you look at the last century, a two-state solution has been on the table since at least 1937.
Right.
And Palestinian leaders have rejected every single two-state solution since then. I mean, Palestine could have been independent and free for the first time in history in 1947 had Palestinian leaders and Arab leaders accepted that solution, and instead they declared war on the unborn Jewish state.
And in the meantime, many innocent lives have been lost and continue to do so. Yardena, thank you so much. Appreciate getting some time with you. Yardena Schwartz, journalist and author. New book is Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. So we appreciate getting some time with her on this Wednesday.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
It's Bloomberg Businessweek. I got some numbers for you, Carol Massar.
Love that.
$1.6 trillion. It's not great, okay?
No.
As of June of this year, that's the amount of outstanding student loans that Americans have. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot. We talk about this a lot.
Some more numbers. About 1 in 4 adults in the U.S. under the age of 40 have student loan debt. Last year, the median amount a person with student debt owed was between $20,000 and about $25,000. This data all courtesy of the Pew Research Center.
And it seems low, especially if you're taking out loans for every year. All right. Also in the world of student loans, Monday marked the end of the 12-month grace period from the Education Department for student loan borrowers. The so-called on-ramp was designed to make it easier for borrowers to start making payments after the COVID-induced 3-year pause of student loan repayments. None of this is a surprise to our next guest. He's Dr. Billy Hensley. He's president and CEO of the National Endowment for Financial Education. It's a nonprofit that works to, well, really help make us all more financially literate. He joins us right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Welcome, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I wish we were all financially literate. I feel like this is something Tim and I have talked about for years.
I feel like if you listen to our show or watch our show as
there.
a kid, you wouldn't have these issues.
Education's a tough one. Tell us about how bad it is and what worries you the most.
Well, outside of student loans themselves, kids are not getting access to financial education, quality financial education. You know, there's financial information, and then there's this rigorous sort of foundational education that we all need. And every time I talk about this work, someone says to me, I wish I had had that.
We've been saying I wish
Yes.
for years. I don't want to date myself, but I feel like I've been talking it from the beginning of my career in business journalism. So why is it? Why do we not consider it important? You know, we used to go back years before me. Home economics was something. People were taught how to cook, to sew.
I had home ec.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, why don't we consider this an important thing for our younger generation?
Well, there's a lot of topics fighting for shelf space in the classroom. So many hours in the day, we're always doing that. But to your point, I have textbooks on my desk in Denver from 1912, math textbooks that have chapters on financial literacy. So it was part of compulsory education at some point. But we're making headwind. 88% of Americans think this should be required. 80% of those same people wish that they had been made to take the class. And so we're at 26 states now that have passed legislation just in the last few years to require this for graduation. They're not all fully implemented yet. Sadly, it takes years and years before those things happen.
Why?
You tell me. I wish I knew.
Elon Musk is putting satellites in the air, going to get us on Mars, and he's created EVs. And why?
We don't know if he'll get us on Mars.
Okay, so maybe he won't get us to Mars. But why is it? Tell me why. Is it too much? Yeah, go ahead. You're rolling your eyes.
Well, it's a myriad of issues. Part of it is expertise, getting teachers trained, getting them access to the right information so that we can have very thorough covering of the subject. The other is every one of us who come from education think our subject is the most important. Right. And so we're all jockeying for time and space and what that looks like. But there are states that are figuring this out. You know, we're at 26 now that have at least a semester of personal finance education. And we're starting to see some of those graduates come through now. And I think too few people know the true measurable benefits of this. Research shows that credit scores within 5 years are 40 points higher than those where it's not required. So that's a true value. Lower utilization of revolving debt, lower credit card delinquency rates. The list is very long, and better borrowing for higher education.
Financial education, financial literacy are huge umbrella terms.
Right.
Give us specifics on what you want taught in school. What do people need to know in order to make good decisions as adults?
Well, to not overwhelm anyone, it is a mini series if you think about it. Everything we do in our life is touching some level of finance. But what the basics here are, it goes beyond budgeting, it goes beyond retirement, it goes beyond emergency funds. This is about the necessity to be the CFO of your financial life. Mm-hmm. What we have found from international data is that in countries where the retirement replacement rate, meaning like their version of Social Security, is high, it's a higher percent of their earned income, financial literacy tends to be lower across the board. And if it's a lower rate, maybe 20, 25, 30% of their income is replaced, then financial literacy is higher because we're putting the burden on you to be the CFO of your life, to navigate your retirement and prepare for that. That holds true in every country but this one. We don't have high either.
Why?
And we have not invested in the
education.
education.
Is it because of education?
Well, I don't think it's education alone. I think we just don't talk about this subject enough. We need to continue to demystify it. And we live in a bubble, right? Because we think about this every day. But people still sort of avoid this topic. Some of it comes from shame. Some of it comes from mistakes. Some of it comes from
maybe some of it comes from inability to actually. We talk about this, right? We talk about wealth versus income. It's tough for some generations.
Is it because we went from a world of pensions, as you've talked about quite a bit, to a world of self-funded retirement?
That's right. And that has happened largely in the last 40 years. Right at the time we were bottoming out on the number of students who were getting financial education or home economics or consumer science or whatever it's called now. And financial literacy as a tool, as a measurement tool, is just getting into its sophistication of research and how we do it well. For many years, and I don't want to pick on our economist friends too much, but for many years we were thinking about everything in terms of financial literacy, from optimizing decision making instead of human growth and development, instead of curriculum and instruction, instead of these other disciplines that really lean into how we learn, when we should learn things. And as we've gained the insight, the case for financial education in schools has become much stronger. Hence, going in the last 5 years from 9 states to 26 that now require it. So we're making headway.
All right, just got about 45 seconds or so left here. Dr. Hensley, I'm curious. So for families who might be listening, or they pick up our podcast later on who've got kids, what's your one piece of advice? If we can't necessarily wait for our educational system to provide this, what should parents do or individuals do?
Well, a lot of this has started in the grassroots. Go to the principal, go to the school board, make the case for this work.
But if you don't want to wait,
like what can we do at home?
I think about Khan Academy that has taught so many different kids about so many different subjects. Why don't we partner with them to create some kind of curriculum that kids can tap into right away?
That's right. There are great resources out there. Let's begin the conversation. Let's demystify the topic so it's a shared value. And the more we do that, the more acceptable it's going to be.
But is it as easy as starting my kids on allowance at a young age?
Yeah.
Understanding that if you do work, you will get paid.
That's exactly right. The applied knowledge, you're applying it in practice now. And that's the thing about money. It's cumulative. As you learn, the earlier you start this, the more cumulative that information will be, and the stronger you'll be later in life.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much. Bill Hensley, Dr. Bill Hensley. He's president and CEO of the National Endowment for Financial Education right here in studio.